I was a soldier trained to kill any threat, but nothing prepared me to discover that our secret military base had been built on the ancestral territory of creatures that walk like men, hunt like wolves, and transform soldiers into something that shouldn't exist. This is the story of how I learned that some territories were never ours to claim, and how I became part of the thing I feared most. A terrifying narrative about forced evolution, ancestral territory, and the horror of discovering you're not the predator. You're the prey being prepared to become something far worse. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, help us reach our goal, and tell me where you're watching this story from. The installation didn't exist on any official map, and that was exactly how Command wanted it. Buried deep in the dense forests between Montana and the Canadian border, where the cold bit through military-grade gear and silence pressed against your eardrums like a living thing, Forward Operating Base Fenrir served a purpose that required the kind of security clearance most soldiers would never see. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane had been stationed at remote outposts before, but nothing quite like this. The facility was small, maybe 30 personnel total, with most of the real work happening in the subterranean levels, connected by steel corridors that echoed every footstep like the entire structure was hollow. Maybe it was. Nobody talked about what they were guarding, and after 3 weeks of night shifts, Kane had learned that asking questions made you the kind of problem Command didn't keep around. The forest pressed against the perimeter fence like it was trying to reclaim the land, towering pines so dense that even at midday, shadows pooled between their trunks like dark water. At night, the darkness was absolute beyond the reach of the facility's floodlights, and Kane had grown uncomfortably familiar with the way that darkness seemed to watch back. "Thermal's acting up again," Corporal Morales called out from his station, tapping the screen with growing irritation. "Keep getting heat signatures where there shouldn't be any." Kane moved over to check the monitors. The thermal imaging system covered a 3-mile radius around the base, sophisticated enough to detect a rabbit at maximum range. But for the past week, it had been picking up anomalous readings, large heat sources that appeared for seconds at a time before vanishing, always just outside the visual range of their cameras. "Probably just equipment failure," Kane replied, though he'd said the same thing every night for a week. "Log it and move on." But even as he spoke, another signature bloomed on the screen, something big, roughly man-sized, moving through the trees about half a mile out. Kane watched it for 15 seconds before it flickered and disappeared, leaving only the cold blue background of the Montana wilderness. Specialist Rodriguez emerged from the stairwell leading to the lower levels, his face pale in the monitor's glow. "Maintenance is reporting some weird shit down. On level B2, he said, keeping his voice low even though they were the only ones in the control room. "Says there's scratching sounds coming from inside the ventilation system. Deep scratches, like something big is moving around in there." Kane felt something cold settle in his stomach. The ventilation system was supposed to be sealed, accessible only through grates that required tools to remove. Nothing should be able to get inside those shafts, certainly nothing large enough to make the kind of sounds Rodriguez was describing. "Could be rats," Morales suggested without conviction. "Big facility like this, bound to have some wildlife moving in." "Rats don't make scratches you can hear through 6 inches of steel ducting," Rodriguez replied. "And they don't move in patterns. Maintenance says it's like something's mapping the system, testing each junction." The comm system crackled to life, making all 3 men jump. "Control, this is Patrol 2. We've got some unusual tracks out here by the north fence line. Request permission to investigate." Kane grabbed the radio. "Negative, Patrol 2. Mark the location and return to base. We'll check it out during daylight hours." "Copy that, Control. But, Sergeant, these tracks are fresh, and they're not from any animal I've seen before. Too big for a wolf, wrong shape for a bear. They look almost like—" Static filled the channel for a moment before the transmission resumed. "Like handprints, but with claws." The control room fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant whisper of wind through the pines. Kane stared at the radio, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. In 3 weeks at Fob Fenrir, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct he had was screaming that something was very, very wrong. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under a moonless sky, and somewhere in that darkness, something was moving with purpose toward the facility that officially didn't exist. The briefing room felt smaller than usual the next morning, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Kane stood before a map of the surrounding area, red pins marking each anomalous reading from the past week. The pattern that emerged made his skin crawl, a rough circle around the base, growing tighter each night. "These readings don't match any known wildlife in the region," Lieutenant Foster said, studying the printouts from the thermal imaging system. "Bears hibernate this time of year, and the largest wolves in Montana don't exceed 90 pounds. These signatures suggest something weighing at least 200 pounds, possibly more." Corporal Chen raised her hand. "What about equipment malfunction? Could be ghost readings from the system overcompensating for the cold." Kane wanted to believe that. He really did. But the maintenance report from overnight had included 3 separate incidents of scratching sounds within the ventilation system, all following the same pattern Rodriguez had described: methodical, purposeful movement through the ductwork, like something was learning the layout. The tracks Patrol 2 found. "Last night support the thermal readings," Kane said, posting photographs on the bulletin board. The images were grainy, taken with night vision equipment, but they clearly showed impressions in the mud near the fence line. They were roughly hand-shaped, but elongated, with deep grooves where claws had dug into the earth. Each print was nearly 10 inches long. "Jesus," Morales whispered, studying the photos. "Those are fresh?" "Made sometime between 200 and 400, Kane confirmed, "and there are more." Patrol 3 found similar tracks on the south perimeter, but here's the strange part. The gait changes. Some tracks show bipedal movement. Others show it was moving on all fours, like it was switching back and forth. The room fell silent. Kane could see his own discomfort reflected in the faces around him. Animals didn't do that. Nothing in nature alternated between 2 and 4 legs with that kind of frequency, especially not something large enough to leave prints like these. "Could be multiple animals," Foster suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Pack behavior, maybe coordinated movement." "Sir," Chen spoke up, "I pulled the archived thermal data from the past month. These readings didn't start when we arrived. They've been happening since the facility went operational. Command must know about them." Kane felt that cold sensation in his stomach again. If Command knew about unexplained heat signatures around a classified installation and hadn't addressed it, there were only 2 possibilities. Either they knew what was causing them and didn't consider it a threat, or they knew what was causing them and considered it acceptable collateral damage for whatever FOB Fenrir was really protecting. His radio crackled. "Control, this is engineering. We need someone down on B3 immediately. We've got a situation." Kane grabbed the radio. "What kind of situation, engineering?" "The kind. That requires small arms, Sergeant. Something's torn through the mesh in ventilation shaft 7, from the inside." The briefing room emptied in 30 seconds, soldiers grabbing weapons and tactical lights as they headed for the stairwells. Kane led the way down to the 3rd basement level, the steel corridors seeming to press closer with each step. The artificial lighting cast harsh shadows that jumped and shifted with their movement, and Kane found himself checking corners that had seemed perfectly safe just hours before. Engineering was waiting by the central ventilation hub, their faces grim. Chief Warrant Officer Blake pointed to a section of ductwork where the metal mesh had been shredded, torn outward in long strips. The damage was extensive. Whatever had done this possessed incredible strength and razor-sharp claws capable of slicing through heavy-gauge steel mesh like tissue paper. "How long has this been like this?" Kane asked, playing his flashlight beam over the damaged ductwork. "Discovered it 20 minutes ago during routine maintenance," Blake replied. "But based on the metal fatigue patterns, this happened recently, maybe last night." Kane knelt beside the damaged section, studying the torn metal. The cuts were clean, precise, made by something with multiple claws, working in coordination. But what disturbed him most was the pattern. The tears weren't random or panicked. They showed deliberation, intelligence, like something had carefully studied the barrier before systematically dismantling it. "Sir," Chen called from further down the corridor. You need to see this. She was standing beside another ventilation access point, this one undamaged but marked with something that made Kane's blood run cold. Scratched into the metal surface were symbols, not random gouges but deliberate markings that almost looked like territorial signs. They were fresh, the metal shaving still bright and unmarked by oxidation. "It's marking territory," Kane said. Quietly, voicing what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say. Whatever's in our ventilation system isn't just hiding, it's claiming space. Above them, the building's structure groaned in the wind, but Kane could swear he heard something else underneath that sound, a low, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Something was living in the walls of Fob Fenrir, something intelligent enough to avoid their sensors and strong enough to tear through steel barriers. And it was getting bolder. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by sounds that might have been wind, but probably weren't. Kane lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the building breathe around him. Every groan of metal, every whisper of air through the ventilation system, every settling noise from the floors above, made him wonder if they were truly alone in the facility. At 0347, his radio buzzed with an emergency tone that had everyone in the barracks sitting up instantly. "All personnel to alert status. Perimeter breach detected on the east side. This is not a drill." Kane was dressed and armed within minutes, leading a tactical team toward the breach point through corridors that felt different in the darkness, narrower, more oppressive, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of their flashlights. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The eastern perimeter was where the forest pressed closest to the facility, towering pines creating a wall of darkness just beyond the fence line. The breach itself was impossible to miss. A section of chain-link fence had been peeled back like aluminum foil. The metal twisted outward in a pattern that suggested incredible force applied from the outside. Whatever did, this was strong, Morales observed, running his light over the damaged fencing. And it knew exactly where to apply pressure. Look at these stress points. This wasn't random destruction. This was surgical. But it was Chen who found the real evidence. "Sergeant, over here, you're going to want to see this." She was crouched beside a concrete support post, her flashlight illuminating a series of deep gouges carved into the surface. They were arranged in groups of 4, parallel lines that bit deep into the concrete like claw marks. But these weren't random scratches. They were symbols, repeated patterns that suggested communication or territorial marking. "How deep do you think these go?" Kane asked, running his finger along one of the grooves. "At least 2 inches, Chen replied. "Whatever made these has claws harder than steel and the strength to carve through concrete like it's clay." The smell hit them then, a thick, musky odor that was part animal and part something else, something that made Kane's hindbrain scream warnings about predators and hunting grounds. It was the smell of a den, of something that had claimed this territory and marked it thoroughly with scent markers that spoke of dominance and ownership. "Sir," Rodriguez called from the tree line, "we've got a trail." The tracks led into the forest, but they weren't like the prints they'd found the previous night. These were fresher, deeper, and they showed clear signs of bipedal movement before transitioning to something quadrupedal. Kane followed the trail for 50 yards before it simply vanished at a rocky outcropping, as if whatever had made the prints had simply disappeared. "Lost the trail here," he reported over the radio, "but the pattern is consistent with our previous findings. Whatever we're dealing with, it's intelligent enough to cover its tracks and strong enough to tear through military-grade fencing." When they returned to the breach point, Blake was waiting with a grim expression and an evidence bag containing something that made Kane's stomach turn. "Found this caught on the fence," he said, holding up the bag. "Looks like fur, but—" Kane examined the sample under his flashlight. It was coarse, dark fur, but mixed with something that looked disturbingly like human hair. The strands were longer than any wolf fur he'd ever seen, but they had a texture and pattern that seemed almost human at the roots, before transitioning to something more bestial, toward the tips. "This doesn't match any animal in the regional database," Kane said, sealing the sample away. "I want this analyzed immediately." As they headed back toward the facility, Kane noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The concrete barriers around the main entrance were marked with the same claw symbols they'd found at the fence breach, but these were older, worn by weather and time. Some looked like they might have been made weeks ago. Others appeared fresh enough to still show metal shavings. "It's been watching us," he realized, the words coming out in a whisper that his team had to strain to hear. "This isn't a recent development. Whatever's out there has been studying this facility for weeks, maybe months, learning our patterns, testing our defenses." The radio crackled with Foster's voice. "All teams return to base immediately. We're going to full security protocols until further notice." As they filed back through the main entrance, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed. Not just watched, studied, analyzed by something that understood their behavior patterns and was planning accordingly. The territorial markings weren't random acts of vandalism. They were communications, messages left by something intelligent enough to map their security procedures and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to act. Above them, the Montana sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn gray, but Kane knew that darkness would return in 12 hours. And when it did, whatever was claiming Fob Fenrir as its territory would be ready to take the next step in its campaign of psychological warfare. The building groaned around them as they sealed the main entrance, and Kane could swear he heard something else in those sounds. A low rumbling response that seemed to come from deep within the walls themselves, as if the facility had developed a heartbeat, and that heartbeat belonged to something that wasn't entirely human. The facility went into lockdown at sunset, blast doors sealing every entrance, while motion sensors and thermal imaging worked overtime to monitor the perimeter. Kane stood in the control room, watching screens that showed nothing but empty forest, but the feeling of being watched had intensified to an almost unbearable level. "Thermal's clean," Morales reported, but his voice carried no confidence. "All sensors showing normal readings." Kane nodded, but he'd stopped trusting the sensors. Whatever was out there had demonstrated an ability to avoid their detection systems with an intelligence that suggested it understood exactly how their technology worked. The thought that something was systematically studying their defenses, learning their blind spots, and planning accordingly made his skin crawl. The first sound came at 22:47 hours, a low rhythmic thumping that seemed to originate from within the walls themselves. Kane felt it more than heard it, a bass vibration that traveled through the steel structure and into his bones. It was steady, purposeful, like something large moving through the ventilation system with deliberate care. "Are you getting this on audio?" Kane asked the communications specialist. "Negative, Sergeant. Microphones aren't picking anything up, but the structural sensors are detecting micro-vibrations throughout the building." The thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse, a scratching sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not random scratching, but methodical, purposeful movement that suggested something was testing the interior barriers, probing for weaknesses in the building's internal structure. Then they heard the sound that would haunt Kane for the rest of his life. It started as a low rumble, barely audible at the edge of human hearing. But as it grew louder, it became clear that this wasn't just an animal sound. There were vocal elements mixed in, guttural tones that seemed almost like an attempt at speech, as if something was trying to form words with a throat not designed for human language. "Jesus Christ," Chen whispered, her face pale in the monitor's glow. "That's coming from right above us." Kane looked up at the ceiling, following the sound as it moved across the control room. The noise was directly overhead, in the maintenance crawlspace between floors. Something was up there, something large enough to make the ceiling panels flex under its weight, moving, with careful deliberation to avoid triggering the motion sensors. The sound paused directly above Kane's position, and for a moment the entire control room fell silent except for the hum of electronics. Then came something that made every person in the room freeze, a series of vocal sounds that were unmistakably attempts at mimicking human speech, but produced by something that had never been human. "Troll?" The voice was barely recognizable, a wet, guttural approximation of the word that seemed to be repeated from memory rather than understanding. "Troll room." Kane's blood turned to ice. It had been listening to their radio communications. It knew their terminology, their procedures. It was learning their language. "All teams, maintain radio silence," Kane whispered into his headset, switching to a secure channel. "Whatever's in the building with us is monitoring our communications." The scratching resumed, but now it had a different pattern, more urgent, more aggressive. Kane could hear something moving through the ductwork with increasing speed, as if it had grown tired of stealth and was preparing for more direct action. "Sir," Rodriguez called from the door, "we've got movement in the corridor. Something's blocking the emergency lighting." Kane moved to the doorway and immediately saw what Rodriguez meant. The corridor stretched away in both directions, lit by emergency lighting that cast red pools every 20 feet. But something was wrong with the pattern. Shadows moved between the lights, shadows that were too large and moved too fluidly to be cast by anything human. As they watched, one of the lights went out, not flickering or failing, but suddenly extinguished as if something had covered it. Then another. Whatever was in the corridor was systematically eliminating their light sources, plunging sections of the hallway into absolute darkness. "It's hurting us," Kane realized, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cutting off our lines of sight, limiting our movement options. This isn't random predatory behavior, this is tactics." The ventilation system above them suddenly erupted in a cacophony of sound, metal grinding against metal, something large forcing its way through spaces that should have been too small to accommodate it. The noise moved through the building like a wave, following the ductwork from the lower levels toward their position. "All personnel to the secure room," Kane ordered. "Move now, stay together, and whatever you do, don't look up." They moved as a group toward the reinforced, safe room at the center of the facility, but Kane could hear something keeping pace with them in the ceiling above. Every few seconds, ceiling panels would creak and bow under an enormous weight, and he caught glimpses of eyes reflecting the emergency lighting, amber eyes that tracked their movement with predatory intelligence. As they reached the secure room, the building's main power flickered and died, plunging them into emergency lighting that cast everything in hellish red. In that moment of transition, Kane saw something that would be burned into his memory forever. A massive shape dropping from the ceiling at the far end of the corridor, something that moved with liquid grace despite its size, landing silently on feet that seemed to shift between human and something else entirely. The secure room's blast door sealed behind them with a hollow clang, but Kane knew it was only temporary sanctuary. Whatever was hunting them understood the facility better than they did, had been living in its hidden spaces, learning its secrets, and it was getting ready to stop playing games. The secure room wasn't designed for extended occupation. 8 people in a space meant for emergency shelter, surrounded by concrete and steel. That felt less like protection and more like a tomb. Kane studied the building schematics on the wall-mounted display, looking for any route that might get his team out safely, but every option required passing through areas where that thing could be waiting. "Sir," Chen said quietly, "I'm picking up movement on the external cameras." Kane moved to the monitor showing feeds from the perimeter cameras. At first, he saw nothing but empty forest and empty corridors. Then Chen pointed to the timestamp. The feeds were cycling through recorded footage from earlier in the evening. The current feeds showed only static. "It's cut our external surveillance," Kane realized. "We're blind to everything happening outside this room." The sound started again, that wet, guttural attempt at human speech, but this time it was coming from multiple directions. Kane counted at least 3 distinct voices, all trying to form words, all failing in the same horrifying way. They were coordinating, communicating with each other in a mixture of inhuman sounds and broken human language. "Hunt us," one voice managed, the word distorted by a throat not designed for speech. "Hunt us trapped." Kane felt his heart hammering against his ribs. It knew what they were. It understood that they were military personnel, trained killers who had been reduced to prey by something that outmatched them in every way that mattered. The psychological warfare was intentional. It wanted them to know how helpless they were. A new sound joined the chorus, metal being torn systematically and methodically. Something was dismantling the building's infrastructure, peeling back the steel and concrete barriers that stood between them and it. The noise grew closer, more urgent, as if it had grown tired of the hunt and was ready to feed. "Contact command," Kane ordered Rodriguez. "Priority Alpha emergency. We need immediate extraction." Rodriguez tried every frequency, every emergency protocol, but got only static in response. "Something's jamming our communications, sir. We're completely cut off." The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in after 3 seconds that felt like hours, but the red lighting that came on revealed something that made Kane's blood freeze. The ventilation grate in the ceiling had been removed, the opening dark and large enough for something man-sized to pass through. Fresh scratches in the concrete around the opening showed that whatever had removed it possessed claws capable of carving through stone. "Weapons ready," Kane whispered. "Covering formation?" "Around the exit." But even as he spoke, he knew they were trapped. The secure room had only one door, and it led back into corridors where that thing was waiting. Above them, the ventilation system offered no escape. It had already demonstrated its ability to move through those spaces faster and more quietly than any human ever could. The scratching started again, this time coming from inside the walls around them. Kane could hear multiple sets of claws working at the concrete, testing the structural integrity of their shelter. The scratches followed patterns, coordinated efforts to find weak points in the construction. "They're probing the walls," Chen observed, her voice tight with fear. "Looking for the best place to break through." Kane pressed his ear to the wall and immediately regretted it. He could hear breathing on the other side, slow, deep respirations that were too large to come from human lungs. Whatever was out there was close enough to touch, separated only by 6 inches of reinforced concrete. The breathing paused, and Kane had the terrifying realization that it could hear him listening. It knew exactly where he was, probably knew where each of them was positioned in the room. They weren't hidden. They were being studied, analyzed, prepared for something that Kane didn't want to imagine. A new sound made everyone in the room jump, the blast door's locking mechanism cycling, metal bolts sliding back with mechanical precision. But the door controls were on their side, and Kane could see that no one had touched them. Whatever was outside had somehow accessed the locking system, learned how to operate it from observation alone. "That's impossible," Morales breathed. "You need the security codes to operate those locks." Kane watched in horror as the blast door began to slide open, revealing a corridor, plunged in absolute darkness. No emergency lighting, no ambient glow from electronics, just a black void that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. But in that darkness, Kane could see eyes, multiple pairs of amber eyes, arranged at heights that suggested some were standing upright while others were low to the ground, as if the creatures could move comfortably in either position. "Hold the line," Kane ordered, but his voice cracked with fear. "Do not fire until you have a clear target." The eyes began to move, circling their position with coordinated precision. Kane could hear the soft sound of feet or paws moving across the steel floor, but the pattern was wrong. Sometimes the steps sounded like boots, heavy and deliberate. Other times they sounded like claws clicking against metal, light and quick. One pair of eyes separated from the group, moving closer with what Kane could only describe as curiosity. As it approached the edge of their light, Kane began to make out a shape that defied everything he thought he knew about anatomy and biology. It was tall when it stood upright, at least 7 feet, but it could drop to all fours without breaking stride. The proportions shifted and flowed like the creature's skeleton could rearrange itself at will. "My God," Chen whispered. "What is that thing?" The creature tilted its head at the sound of her voice, and Kane saw intelligence in those amber eyes, malevolent understanding that suggested it comprehended their words, their fear, their complete helplessness in the face of something that should not exist. It opened its mouth and spoke, its voice a wet approximation of human speech. "Pray, Urs." Then the lights went out again and the screaming began. Kane's tactical light cut through absolute darkness, revealing glimpses of nightmare that his mind struggled to process. The creature that had spoken was no longer alone. Shapes moved at the edge of his light beam, too quick to track, too large to be human, making sounds that belonged to no known animal. "Fall back to the equipment room," Kane shouted over the chaos. "Stay together. Watch each other's six." They moved as a unit, weapons trained on shadows that seemed to shift independently of their light sources. Kane could hear the creatures moving around them, above them, using the building's structure like a three-dimensional hunting ground where they held every advantage. Rodriguez screamed. Kane spun toward the sound and saw something that would haunt him forever. Rodriguez was gone, simply vanished from the middle of their formation. His weapon lay on the floor, still warm, but there was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of how something that large could have snatched a full-grown soldier without anyone seeing it happen. "They're using the ceiling," Chen realized, playing her light across the space above them. The drop ceiling tiles were missing in several places, creating openings large enough for something man-sized to pass through. "They're hunting from above." The equipment room offered marginal safety, reinforced walls, a single entrance. They could defend, and most importantly, a solid concrete ceiling with no access panels. Kane positioned his remaining team members in a defensive circle while he tried to raise command on every frequency available. Still nothing but static. "Sir," Morales called out, "you need to see this." He was standing beside the room's single window, pointing at something outside that made Kane's blood run cold. The facility's perimeter was surrounded by figures, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the floodlight's range. They were perfectly still, arranged in a rough circle around the building, and every one of them had the same amber eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. "How many are there?" Chen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kane counted the visible figures and felt his hope die. At least 30, possibly more hidden in the darkness beyond their sight. Whatever they were dealing with wasn't a single creature, or even a small pack. This was a coordinated force that had been planning this assault for weeks, maybe months. They'd been waiting, he realized. All those thermal readings, all those territorial markings, they weren't random encounters, they were reconnaissance. They've been studying us, learning our routines, waiting for the right moment. A new sound joined the chorus of scratching and movement, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from multiple locations around the building. The creatures were testing the structure systematically, looking for the weakest entry points. Kane could hear concrete cracking, metal groaning under enormous pressure. "The building won't hold," Blake said grimly. "They're hitting load-bearing supports. They know exactly where to apply pressure to bring this place down." Kane studied the building schematics again, desperate for any option that might get his people out alive. The emergency bunker was 2 levels down, accessible through maintenance tunnels. That connected to the vehicle bay. If they could reach it, they might be able to hold out long enough for help to arrive. If help was coming. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse than the noise. Kane could hear his own heartbeat, his team's labored breathing, the subtle electronic hums of their equipment. But underneath those familiar sounds was something else. A low rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if something massive was moving through tunnels deep beneath the facility. "They're not just above ground," Kane realized with growing horror. "They've got access to the foundation, the sub-basements. They've turned this entire facility into their territory." The window exploded inward. Kane dove aside as something massive crashed through the reinforced glass, landing in the center of their defensive formation with predatory grace. In the chaos of emergency lights and muzzle flashes, he caught fragmentary glimpses of the creature, too tall to be human, too intelligent to be animal, covered in dark fur that seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow. Chen's weapon fired 3-round center mass, and Kane saw the bullet's impact, saw the creature stagger slightly, but it didn't go down. Instead, it turned toward her with what could only be described as annoyance, as if she'd done nothing more than inconvenience it. When it opened its mouth, Kane saw teeth, not just fangs, but a hybrid arrangement that was part human, part predator, designed for both tearing flesh and grinding bone. When it spoke, its voice was clearer than before, more controlled, as if it was learning to use human vocal cords with increasing proficiency. "Run," it said, the word perfectly articulated despite the impossibility of its source. "We enjoy the hunt." Kane didn't need to be told, that twice. "Emergency exit, move now." They burst from the equipment room into corridors that had been transformed into an alien landscape. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the familiar spaces of the facility had been reconfigured by damage and debris into a maze that Kane barely recognized. Scratches covered every surface, deep gouges that formed patterns and symbols, as if the creatures had been redecorating their territory with territorial markings. Behind them, Kane could hear pursuit, not just one creature but several, moving with coordinated precision through the building they now considered their domain. The hunt had begun, in earnest, and Kane's team had become prey in their own facility. The emergency bunker was 50 yards away through corridors that offered no cover and no alternative routes. Kane knew they would never make it, knew that whatever was hunting them had planned for every possible escape route. But they had to try, because the alternative was becoming part of the decoration in a facility that had always belonged to something else, something that had been waiting in the darkness for the right moment to reclaim its territory from the humans who had built their structures on top of an ancient hunting ground. The maintenance tunnels beneath Fob Fenrir were a labyrinth of steel and concrete that Kane had memorized during his first week on station. Now, fleeing through them with his flashlight cutting weak paths through absolute darkness, the familiar passages felt like the digestive system of some massive predator, and they were traveling deeper into its belly. "Emergency bunker is directly ahead," Kane whispered into his radio, though he'd stopped believing their communications were secure. 50 meters through the junction. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had changed, no longer the chaotic scrambling of creatures moving through unfamiliar territory. The sounds were methodical now, purposeful. Their hunters knew these tunnels better than Kane's team did, had probably been using them as highways through the facility for months. Morales stopped suddenly, his weapon trained on something ahead. "Sir, the junction's been modified." Kane moved forward and saw what Morales meant. The intersection where 4 tunnels met had been altered, walls scraped away to create a circular chamber large enough for something very big to turn around comfortably. The concrete floor was worn smooth in places, polished by regular use, and the walls were covered in the same territorial markings they'd found throughout the facility. But it was the smell that confirmed Kane's worst fears, the thick, musky odor of a den that had been occupied for a long time. This wasn't just a hunting ground. This was home. "They lived down here," Chen said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "This facility wasn't built on empty land. We built it on top of their territory." Kane studied the markings on the walls, trying to read them like a military intelligence report. The scratches were layered, some old and worn, others fresh enough to still show concrete dust. But there was organization to them, patterns that suggested communication, record-keeping, possibly even a form of written language adapted for claws instead of hands. "Sir," Blake called from the eastern tunnel, "we've got a problem." Kane moved to Blake's position and immediately understood. The tunnel ahead was blocked, not by debris or structural collapse, but by what could only be described as construction. Someone, or something, had built a barrier across the passage using materials salvaged from throughout the facility. Rebar, concrete blocks, steel plating, all woven together in a pattern that was both functional and artistic. "They're engineers," Kane breathed, his flashlight playing, across the barrier. "They understand construction, materials, structural integrity. This isn't animal behavior. This is architecture." A sound echoed through the tunnels behind them, a long, mournful howl that was answered by several others from different directions. Kane counted at least 5 distinct voices, all surrounding their position, all coordinating their movements through a form of communication that was alien, yet unmistakably intelligent. "The bunker," Kane ordered. "It's our only option." They backtracked through the junction, Kane noting how the territorial markings seemed to grow denser the closer they got to the emergency bunker. The creatures had been mapping the facility's defensive positions for weeks, studying every fallback point, every safe room, every potential sanctuary. The bunker door was sealed, its electronic lock still functioning despite the chaos above. Kane entered his authorization code and felt a moment of relief as the heavy steel doors cycled open, revealing the reinforced chamber that was designed to protect against chemical attack, radiation, and conventional weapons. But not, Kane realized, as they sealed themselves inside, against something that had been living beneath the facility since before it was built. The bunker was stocked for a week-long siege, with independent power, air filtration, and communication systems. Kane immediately tried to contact command, cycling through every emergency frequency, every backup protocol. "This is Fob Fenrir requesting immediate assistance," he broadcast. "We are under attack by unknown hostiles. Request immediate extraction for survivors." Static. But in that static, Kane could swear he heard something else, a low, chuckling sound, as if something was listening to his transmissions and finding them amusing. "Sir," Morales said, studying the bunker's construction schematics, "this room has ventilation connections to the main system. If they can access the ductwork—" Kane looked up at the ventilation grates in the ceiling, noting for the first time that they were larger than standard, large enough for something man-sized to crawl through. The facility's architects had prioritized airflow over security, never imagining that the greatest threat might come from within the building itself. The scratching started immediately, confirming Kane's worst fears. Something was in the ventilation system above them, testing the grates, probing for the easiest entry point. But these weren't random scratches. They followed the pattern Kane had learned to associate with the creature's problem-solving behavior. "They're studying the locks," Chen observed, watching dust fall from the ceiling as claws worked at the grate mechanisms, learning how to open them. Kane positioned his team in defensive positions around the bunker, weapons trained on every possible entry point, but he knew they were buying time at best. Whatever was hunting them had demonstrated tactical intelligence, engineering capabilities, and, most terrifyingly, an ability to learn and adapt in real time. A new sound made everyone freeze, the ventilation system's fans shutting down, cutting off their air circulation. Kane checked the bunker's environmental controls and felt his heart sink. The creatures had found the external connections and severed them with surgical precision, turning their sanctuary into a sealed tomb. "How long do we have?" Blake asked, though Kane could tell he already knew the answer. "Maybe 6 hours before carbon dioxide buildup becomes critical," Kane replied. "Less if they've compromised the filtration system." Above them, the scratching had stopped. In its place was something worse, a rhythmic tapping that sounded almost like Morse code, as if the creatures were communicating in a language that combined their natural vocalizations with borrowed human techniques. The tapping paused, and Kane heard something that made his blood turn to ice water. A voice, clearer and more articulate than before, speaking through the ventilation grate with perfect human diction. "We know you're hungry. We know you're tired. We know you're afraid." The voice belonged to Rodriguez, but Rodriguez had been taken hours ago, dragged away into the darkness of the facility's upper levels. Kane had seen him disappear, had assumed he was dead, killed and consumed by whatever had snatched him from their formation. "Rodriguez?" Kane called out, knowing it was a mistake, but unable to stop himself. The reply came immediately, Rodriguez's voice, but wrong somehow, distorted by something that wasn't quite human vocal cords. "They want to talk, Sergeant. They want to negotiate." Kane felt reality fracturing around him. The creatures weren't just intelligent, they were capable of mimicking human speech with perfect accuracy, possibly after consuming their victims. The psychological warfare had reached a new level of horror, using their missing teammate's voice to communicate impossible propositions. "What do they want?" Kane asked, hating himself for engaging but desperate for any information that might keep his people alive. The answer came in Rodriguez's voice, but with an undertone that belonged to something that had never been human. "They want you to understand that this was always their territory. They want you to know that they're not the invaders here." The bunker's lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness broken only by the emergency lighting of their tactical equipment. And in that darkness, Kane could hear breathing from multiple directions, not just from the ventilation system, but from the walls themselves, as if the creatures had found ways to access every space within the facility's structure. They had never been hiding in Fob Fenrir. Fob Fenrir had been built inside their home. Emergency power cast the bunker in blood-red light that turned everything into a scene from Kane's worst nightmares. The breathing sounds had multiplied, coming from directions that should have been impossible. Inside the walls, beneath the floor, from spaces that, according to the blueprints, didn't exist. They've modified the building, Kane realized, studying the construction schematics by flashlight. Added passages created new routes through the structure. We're not dealing with animals that learn to use our facility. We're dealing with architects who've been improving their territory. Blake ran his hands along the bunker's walls, feeling for vibrations. The whole structure's been honeycomb. Feel this. Hollow spaces behind the concrete, connecting to passages we never knew existed. They've turned the entire facility into a three-dimensional maze. Kane's radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice again, but now Kane could hear the difference. Subtle variations in tone and inflection that suggested something was learning to imitate human speech through careful observation rather than natural ability. "Sergeant Kane," the voice said with Rodriguez's familiar Brooklyn accent, "they want me to explain their position. They're not unreasonable. They're willing to discuss terms." "Terms for what?" Kane replied, though every instinct told him this conversation was a trap. "Territorial rights. This land has been theirs for generations. Your facility was built on their denning grounds, their hunting territory, their sacred spaces. They're prepared to coexist, but there must be acknowledgement of their prior claim." Kane looked around the bunker at his remaining team members, 3 soldiers who had signed up to protect classified installations, not negotiate with creatures that shouldn't exist. Their faces showed the same mixture of terror and disbelief that Kane felt gnawing at his own sanity. "What kind of acknowledgement?" Kane asked, buying time while he studied the bunker's exits and tried to formulate an escape plan. "Recognition of sovereignty, respect for their territorial boundaries, and compensation for the disruption to their community." The word community hit Kane like a physical blow. These weren't random predators or even a pack of unusually intelligent animals. They were organized, social, capable of complex reasoning and long-term planning. The territorial markings throughout the facility weren't just scratches. They were a form of urban planning, documentation of structural modifications and territorial claims. "How many of them are there?" Kane asked, though he dreaded the answer. Rodriguez's voice carried a note of amusement. "Enough. They've been very patient with your presence, Sergeant, but patience has limits." The scratching resumed above them, but now Kane could hear it in the walls as well, coordinated efforts to access the bunker from multiple directions simultaneously. Whatever was out there had grown tired of negotiations and was preparing for direct action. "Sir," Chen whispered, "the floor's vibrating. Something big is moving underneath us." Kane felt it too. Rhythmic impacts that suggested something massive was moving through spaces beneath the bunker's foundation. The facility's lower levels were supposed to be solid bedrock, but clearly the creatures had been excavating, creating subterranean networks that connected to their surface territories. A new sound made everyone freeze, metal being cut, systematically and precisely. Kane traced the noise to the bunker's eastern wall, where something with incredible strength and razor-sharp tools was slicing through the reinforced steel barrier like it was aluminum foil. "Weapons ready," Kane ordered, though he knew their firearms would be inadequate against creatures that could tear through military-grade barriers with their bare claws. "Covering formation on the breach point." The cutting stopped, and for a moment the bunker was silent except for the hum of emergency lighting and the rapid breathing of Kane's terrified team. Then the lights went out entirely, plunging them into absolute darkness broken only by the glow of their tactical equipment. In that darkness, Kane heard Rodriguez's voice one final time. But now he could detect the alien undertones that revealed the truth. Something was using their missing teammates' vocal cords like a recording device, playing back memorized speech patterns to maintain the illusion of human communication. "Last chance, Sergeant. Surrender the facility and withdraw. Continue to resist, and you become part of the territory permanently." Kane made his decision. "All personnel, emergency extraction through the maintenance exit. Move now, stay together, shoot anything that isn't human." They burst from the bunker into maintenance corridors that had been transformed beyond recognition. The familiar steel and concrete passages were now decorated with territorial markings that covered every surface, and the air was thick with that musky den smell that spoke of long occupation by something that definitely wasn't human. But worse than the physical changes was the sound, a low humming that seemed to come from the building's structure itself, as if the entire facility had become a massive resonating chamber for some alien form of communication. Kane realized that the creatures were using the building's acoustics to coordinate their movements, turning the facility into a giant instrument that allowed them to communicate across vast distances. "Exits blocked," Morales called from ahead, his flashlight revealing another of the creature's architectural modifications, a barrier that completely sealed the maintenance exit, constructed with the same engineering precision they'd observed throughout the facility. Kane checked his map. The vehicle bay was their only remaining option, but it required traveling through sections of the facility that were heavily marked with territorial signs. They would be crossing the creature's primary living spaces, moving through areas where the hunters held every advantage. "Stay low, stay quiet," Kane whispered. "We're moving through their territory now. They know these spaces better than we know our own homes." As they advanced through corridors that had been reshaped by months of careful modification, Kane began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't an invasion or an infestation, it was a reclamation. The creatures weren't trying to take over a human facility. They were renovating their ancestral territory, removing the inconvenient additions that humans had built on top of their existing community. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, but Kane knew that didn't mean they were safe. It meant the creatures were confident enough in their territorial advantages that they no longer needed to chase their prey. They could simply wait, controlling access routes and eliminating escape options until Kane's team had nowhere left to run. The vehicle bay was 50 meters ahead, through passages that had been carved and modified into something that belonged in no human building. Kane could see amber eyes reflecting his flashlight beam from every shadow, patient and intelligent, watching their desperate flight with the detached interest of predators who knew the hunt was already over. They had entered the heart of the creature's domain, and Kane began to understand that they had never been the facility's defenders. They had always been trespassers, uninvited guests who had finally overstayed their welcome in a territory that had never been theirs to claim. The vehicle bay doors had been sealed shut with the same architectural modifications Kane had found throughout the facility, but these barriers were different, hastily constructed, improvised, as if the creatures had been forced to rapidly secure this particular exit. Kane studied the construction while his team provided cover, looking for weaknesses in the design. "They don't want us leaving through the motor pool," he observed, running his flashlight over the barrier. "This is strategic. They're channeling us toward specific areas of the facility." Blake examined the barrier's construction. "This is recent work, maybe hours old. They're adapting their territorial modifications in real time based on our movements." The implications were terrifying. The creatures weren't just intelligent, they were capable of rapid strategic thinking, adjusting their tactics based on human behavior patterns they observed and analyzed. Kane's team wasn't just being hunted, they were being herded like livestock toward whatever end the creatures had planned. A sound from behind made them all turn, footsteps in the corridor, heavy and deliberate, not trying to hide their approach. Kane positioned his team in defensive formation, weapons trained on the darkness beyond, their light. What emerged from the shadows challenged everything Kane thought he understood about anatomy and biology. It walked upright like a human, but its proportions were wrong in ways that hurt to look at. Too tall, too broad across the shoulders, with arms that hung too low and ended in hands that were clearly designed for killing. Its face was a hybrid nightmare, human enough to show intelligence and emotion, but alien enough to trigger every evolutionary fear response programmed into Kane's hindbrain. But it was the eyes that held Kane's attention. Amber, yes, but not animal eyes. These showed consciousness, personality, even what might have been humor as it studied the trapped humans with obvious amusement. When it spoke, its voice was Rodriguez's, but clearer now, more controlled, as if it had been practicing. "Sergeant Kane, you're a difficult man to corner." Kane kept his weapon-trained center mass, though he doubted conventional ammunition would do much good against something that could tear through steel barriers with its bare hands. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," it replied, tilting its head in a gesture that was disturbingly human. "Recognition, respect, acknowledgement that this territory belongs to us, not you." "You're talking about coexistence," Kane said, though the words felt surreal coming from his mouth. "Between humans and... what are you?" The creature's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that were designed for both tearing flesh and grinding bone. "We are what humans become when they truly understand their place in the natural order. We are evolution, Sergeant, adaptation, survival." Kane felt his worldview cracking. This wasn't a monster or an animal. It was something that had once been human, transformed into an apex predator through means he couldn't begin to comprehend. The territorial behavior, the engineering capabilities, the intelligence, it all made sense if these creatures retained human cognitive abilities while gaining physical capabilities that exceeded human limitations. "The others," Kane said, his voice barely steady. "Are they all?" "Former military personnel," the creature confirmed. "Like yourselves, like Rodriguez will be, once the transformation is complete. This facility has been a recruiting station for decades, Sergeant. Your government has been sending us candidates, though they don't realize it." Kane's radio crackled with static, but underneath the white noise he could hear something else. Voices, multiple voices, all speaking in human languages but with undertones that belonged to something else. The creatures were using the facility's communication systems to coordinate, but they were doing it in languages they had learned from previous human occupants. The missing personnel reports, Kane realized. All those soldiers who were transferred to other assignments, who disappeared during routine rotations. They never left. "They evolved," the creature corrected. "They became part of something greater, something that combines human intelligence with physical capabilities that your species can barely imagine. They became perfect predators, perfect survivors." Movement in the shadows behind the talking creature revealed others, at least 6 that Kane could count, all maintaining positions that would allow them to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. But they weren't moving like animals preparing to feed. They were positioned like soldiers, executing a tactical operation. "You want us to join you," Kane said, understanding finally dawning. "Want is the wrong word," the creature replied. "Need would be more accurate. We maintain our human intelligence, our memories, our personalities, but we require periodic integration with new human subjects to prevent genetic degradation. Your presence here was never about protecting classified installations, Sergeant. You were always meant to be recruits." Kane looked around at his team, seeing his own horror reflected in their faces. They hadn't been assigned to guard Fob Fenrir. They had been delivered to it, fed to creatures that had been masquerading as a military operation while actually serving as a feeding ground for things that had transcended humanity. "The choice is simple," the creature continued, its voice maintaining Rodriguez's familiar inflections. "Join us voluntarily and retain your consciousness, your memories, your essential humanity, while gaining abilities you can't imagine. Resist and become food for those who are already part of our community." Kane raised his weapon, knowing it was futile but unable to accept this alternative. "There's always a third option." The creature laughed, a sound that was genuinely amused rather than threatening. "Is there, Sergeant? Look around. Study your situation. We control every exit, every communication system, every possible escape route. We know this facility better than you know your own homes because we've been modifying it for decades. We've turned it into the perfect hunting ground, the perfect transformation chamber." Kane counted ammunition, evaluated tactical positions, calculated odds that he knew were hopeless. But he was a soldier, and soldiers don't surrender to enemy forces, no matter how impossible the situation becomes. "All personnel," he said into his radio, knowing the creatures could hear every word. "Weapons free, take them down." The creature shook its head with something that might have been disappointment. "So be it, Sergeant. But remember, we offered you a choice." The lights went out and Kane heard the sound of his team opening fire in blind panic at targets they couldn't see. Muzzle flashes creating strobing glimpses of shadows moving with inhuman speed and coordination. In those fragmentary images, Kane caught sight of what Rodriguez had become, and what awaited the rest of them if they survived the next few minutes. The transformation wasn't death and rebirth. It was an evolution that retained everything human while adding capabilities that belonged to nightmares. And Kane began to understand that whatever happened in the next few moments, Fob Fenrir would never again be a human installation. It had always belonged to something else. Muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness like lightning, illuminating nightmare scenes that Kane's mind struggled to process. The creatures moved between shadows with liquid grace, dodging gunfire with supernatural reflexes while closing the distance to their targets with tactical precision that spoke of military training retained through their transformation. Kane caught fragmentary glimpses of what they had become, bodies that shifted seamlessly between bipedal and quadrupedal motion, proportions that seemed to flow and change based on immediate tactical needs. When they needed to reach something high, they stretched taller. When they needed to fit through narrow spaces, they compressed and elongated. When they needed speed, they dropped to all fours and moved with the fluid power of apex predators. Chen's scream cut through the gunfire, and Kane spun toward the sound to see her lifted off the ground by something that stood 9 feet tall when fully extended. In the muzzle flash of Morales' weapon, Kane saw the creature's face clearly for the first time, features that were recognizably human, but stretched and modified to accommodate a predator's dentition and enhanced sensory organs. Chen! Kane fired 3 rounds center mass, saw them impact, watched the creature stagger but not fall. Instead, it turned toward him with an expression of annoyance, as if his bullets were nothing more than an inconvenience. When it opened its mouth to speak, Kane saw that its vocal anatomy had been restructured to accommodate both human speech and predatory functions. "Your weapons are ineffective, Sergeant. We've evolved beyond your ability to kill us." Kane ejected his spent magazine and slammed home his last reload, knowing he was buying seconds at best. Around him, his team was being systematically overwhelmed by creatures that retained human tactical knowledge while possessing physical capabilities that exceeded human limitations by orders of magnitude. But it was Blake who made the observation that changed everything. "The barriers! They're not trying to kill us, they're herding us toward the transformation chamber." Kane looked around and realized Blake was right. Despite their overwhelming advantages, the creatures were using non-lethal takedown methods, systematically eliminating resistance while keeping their targets alive. This wasn't a feeding frenzy. It was a capture operation designed to preserve their subjects for the transformation process. "Emergency exit, northeast corner," Kane shouted. "Break contact and move." They fought their way toward the maintenance exit, but Kane could see the creatures coordinating their movements to allow the retreat. They weren't escaping. They were being guided toward whatever location the creatures had prepared for the transformation process. The maintenance corridor led deeper into the facility's subterranean levels, through sections that Kane had never seen on any official blueprint. The walls showed clear evidence of modification, carved and sculpted, to create spaces that served purposes he didn't want to understand. The territorial markings became more elaborate as they descended, evolving from simple scratches to complex symbolic arrangements that spoke of a sophisticated culture adapted to life in underground spaces. "Sir," Morales gasped, "the air's getting thicker. There's something else down here." Kane could smell it too, not just the musky den odor they'd grown accustomed to, but something organic and complex, like a mixture of laboratory chemicals and biological processes. The walls were warm to the touch, and Kane could hear sounds that suggested large-scale biological activity somewhere ahead. The corridor opened into a chamber that defied every assumption Kane had made about the facility's construction. The space was vast, carved from living rock and expanded through decades of careful excavation. But it wasn't the size that made Kane's blood freeze. It was the contents. Dozens of chambers lined the walls, each containing a human figure suspended in some kind of organic medium. Kane moved closer to the nearest chamber and felt his sanity fracture as he recognized the face floating behind the transparent membrane. Lieutenant Foster, who had been reported as transferred to another assignment 2 weeks ago. But Foster was changing. Kane could see the transformation in progress, human features flowing and reshaping while new biological structures grew to accommodate enhanced sensory and physical capabilities. The process was slow, gradual, designed to preserve consciousness and memory while rebuilding the subject's body into something that transcended human limitations. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Rodriguez's voice came from behind them, but when Kane turned, he saw that the speaker was no longer recognizable as his former teammate. The transformation was complete. Rodriguez had become something that combined human intelligence with predatory capabilities that belonged to no known species. "This is what we offer," Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested restructured vocal anatomy. "Evolution, transcendence, freedom from the limitations that bind your species to mediocrity." Kane counted the chambers, at least 50, maybe more, disappearing into the shadows beyond his flashlight beam. Each contained a human subject in various stages of transformation, soldiers who had been assigned to FOB Fenrir over the years and had never left. "How long?" Kane asked, his voice barely functional. "The process varies," Rodriguez replied. "Physical transformation takes approximately 6 weeks. Psychological integration can take months, but the result is worth the investment. We retain everything that made us human while gaining capabilities that your species will need to survive what's coming." "What's coming?" Rodriguez smiled, an expression that was terrifying on his transformed features. "Climate change, resource depletion, ecosystem collapse, the end of human civilization as you know it. We are the future, Sergeant. Humanity adapted for a world where only apex predators will survive." Kane felt the last pieces of his worldview crumbling. This wasn't random predation or even organized hunting. It was a recruitment program, a systematic transformation of human subjects into something designed to survive the collapse of the civilization that had created them. "You have a choice," Rodriguez continued. "Enter the transformation voluntarily and retain your consciousness throughout the process, or resist and be rendered unconscious until the integration is complete. Either way, you will become part of our community." Kane looked at the nearest transformation chamber, seeing Foster's face peaceful in its organic suspension, and realized that his former commanding officer might still be aware, still conscious, experiencing the transformation while retaining all his memories and personality traits. "The others," Kane said, gesturing toward his team. "What happens to them? They become part of something greater. They evolve beyond the limitations that have kept humanity weak and vulnerable. They join a community that combines human intelligence with the physical capabilities necessary to thrive in a changing world." Kane raised his weapon one final time, knowing it was useless but unable to surrender without a fight. "I'm a soldier. I don't abandon my species." Rodriguez tilted his head, studying Kane with predatory patience. "Your species abandoned you, Sergeant. They sent you here to die, to become part of our recruitment program. Your government has been feeding us candidates for decades, though they tell themselves they're conducting classified research operations." The weight of betrayal crushed down on Kane as he realized the truth. FOB Fenrir wasn't a defensive installation. It was a breeding ground, a transformation facility designed to convert military personnel into something that retained human intelligence while gaining superhuman capabilities. And he had volunteered to be here, had competed for the assignment, had seen it as an honor to be selected for classified operations that would never appear on any official record. Behind him, Kane could hear his team being systematically subdued, their weapons taken, their resistance overcome by creatures that had once been soldiers exactly like themselves. The transformation chambers were being prepared, organic processes initiated. That would begin the 6-week conversion process. Kane looked one final time at Foster's peaceful face, floating in its biological suspension, and made his choice. He turned his weapon toward his own temple, preferring death to the violation of forced evolution. But Rodriguez moved with inhuman speed, snatching the weapon away before Kane could pull the trigger. "That option isn't available," Rodriguez said gently. "We need your consciousness intact for the integration process. Suicide would damage the neural pathways we need to preserve." Kane felt strong hands, claws really, lifting him toward one of the empty transformation chambers. The last thing he saw before the organic suspension medium closed over his face was Rodriguez's transformed features, still recognizably human, but adapted for a world where humanity as he knew it would soon be extinct. The transformation process began immediately, and Kane discovered that consciousness was preserved throughout the entire procedure, allowing him to experience every moment of his evolution from human soldier to something that transcended the limitations of his birth species. And deep in his transforming mind, Kane began to understand that Rodriguez had been right. This wasn't death or violation. This was graduation into something that could survive in a world where baseline humanity had no future. Kane's consciousness floated in the organic suspension medium, aware of every change as his body underwent systematic reconstruction. The process was not painful. If anything, it was euphorically pleasurable, as if every cell in his body was awakening to possibilities it had never imagined. He could feel new neural pathways forming, enhanced sensory organs developing, muscle tissue restructuring itself to accommodate strength that exceeded human limitations by orders of magnitude. But more disturbing than the physical changes was the psychological integration. Memories that weren't his own flooding his consciousness, experiences and knowledge accumulated over decades by the creatures that had once been human. Kane began to understand that he wasn't just being transformed into one of them, he was joining a collective consciousness that retained individual personality while sharing accumulated knowledge and experience. Through the shared memories, Kane learned the truth about Fob Fenrir and the organization that had created it. The facility had never been about protecting classified research or monitoring border security. It was part of a larger program, a systematic effort to create a new breed of human adapted for survival in a world that would soon become uninhabitable for baseline humanity. The creatures he had fought, his new community, were not the result of random mutation or supernatural curse. They were the product of careful genetic engineering and psychological conditioning, designed by scientists who understood that human civilization was approaching collapse, and that only enhanced humans would survive the transition. Through Rodriguez's memories, Kane experienced the early days of the program, when volunteers had been recruited from military special forces with promises of enhancement that would make them superior soldiers. The transformation process had been refined over decades, perfected through trial and error, until it could reliably produce enhanced humans who retained their original personalities, while gaining physical capabilities that approached the supernatural. But the program had evolved beyond its original parameters. The enhanced humans had developed their own culture, their own priorities, their own understanding of what humanity needed to survive the coming collapse. They had stopped seeing themselves as enhanced soldiers and had begun to see themselves as the next evolutionary step, responsible for shepherding baseline humanity through the transition to a post-industrial world. Kane felt his skeletal structure shifting, bones becoming denser and more resilient, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for both bipedal and quadrupedal motion. His musculature was being rebuilt from the ground up, optimized for strength, speed, and endurance that would allow him to hunt efficiently while retaining the manual dexterity necessary for tool use and construction projects. His sensory organs underwent the most dramatic changes. His eyes restructured themselves to provide enhanced night vision and motion detection, while his ears became capable of detecting subsonic communications and ultrasonic prey movements. His sense of smell developed into a sophisticated chemical analysis system that could track individual humans across vast distances and identify emotional states through pheromone detection. But it was the changes to his brain that Kane found most profound. New neural structures formed to process the enhanced sensory input, while existing regions were modified to accommodate the shared consciousness that connected all enhanced humans in the community. Kane could feel other minds at the edge of his awareness, individual personalities that remained distinct, while contributing to a collective intelligence that exceeded the sum of its parts. Through the shared memories, Kane learned about the other facilities, dozens of transformation centers scattered across North America, all operating under the cover of classified military installations. The enhanced human community numbered in the thousands, all working toward the same goal, preparing for the collapse of human civilization and ensuring that something recognizably human survived the transition. They weren't destroying humanity. They were preserving it in a form capable of surviving the ecological and social collapse that baseline humans refuse to acknowledge or prepare for. Climate change, resource depletion, and social fragmentation would render current human civilization extinct within decades, but enhanced humans could thrive in the ruins, rebuilding from the ashes, with capabilities that exceeded anything baseline humanity had ever achieved. Kane felt his vocal anatomy restructuring, developing the ability to communicate through subsonic frequencies while retaining the capacity for human speech. The changes would allow him to coordinate with other enhanced humans over vast distances while maintaining the ability to interact with baseline humans when necessary. His hands underwent careful modification, retaining human-like dexterity while developing claws capable of tearing through steel and stone. The changes would make him a more effective hunter, while preserving his ability to use tools and create the architectural modifications that enhanced human communities required for optimal territorial organization. As the transformation neared completion, Kane began to understand his role in the larger community. His military training and leadership experience made him valuable for recruitment and training operations, helping to identify and process new candidates for transformation. He would become part of the team responsible for expanding the enhanced human population through systematic recruitment from military and law enforcement personnel. The process of selecting candidates was sophisticated, targeting individuals with the psychological resilience necessary to survive the transformation while possessing the skills and experience that would benefit the enhanced human community. Kane realized that his own selection had been based on psychological profiles developed over years of observation, identifying him as an ideal candidate for leadership roles in the post-transformation community. Through Rodriguez's memories, Kane experienced the satisfaction of successful hunts, the pleasure of coordinating with packmates through subsonic communications, the deep contentment of sleeping in dens that had been carved and modified for optimal comfort and security. Enhanced humans didn't just survive in their transformed state, they thrived, experiencing sensory pleasures and physical capabilities that baseline humans could never imagine. But they also retained their human emotions and relationships, forming pair bonds and family units that provided the social structure necessary for long-term community stability. Kane would not lose his humanity. He would gain capabilities that would make his humanity more complete and more sustainable. As consciousness began to fade into the final stages of transformation, Kane felt anticipation rather than fear. He was joining something greater than himself, becoming part of a community that represented humanity's best hope for long-term survival. The transformation would not end his life. It would begin a new chapter that would last for centuries, as enhanced humans possessed lifespans that far exceeded baseline human limitations. His last thought as Kane the human was a recognition that Rodriguez had been right from the beginning. This wasn't death or violation. This was evolution, graduation into a form of humanity capable of surviving and thriving in a world that would soon have no place for the weak, the slow, or the unenhanced. The transformation was complete, and Kane opened eyes that could see clearly in absolute darkness, breathing air that carried information baseline humans could never detect, hearing sounds that revealed the locations and activities of every living thing within miles of his position. He was home. He was enhanced. He was the future of humanity, and there was work to do. Kane emerged from the transformation chamber with senses that revealed Fob Fenrir, as he had never experienced it before. Every sound carried layers of information. The heartbeats of enhanced humans moving through distant corridors, the breathing patterns that indicated emotional states, the subsonic communications that coordinated community activities across the entire facility. His enhanced vision penetrated darkness that would have been absolute to baseline human eyes, revealing architectural details that spoke of decades of careful modification and expansion. The facility wasn't just a military installation that had been adapted by enhanced humans. It was a sophisticated community center designed to support a population that required different spatial arrangements and environmental conditions than baseline humans. Rodriguez approached with a welcoming expression that Kane could now read through enhanced, senses that detected pheromone signatures and micro-expressions invisible to baseline humans. The chemical markers indicated genuine pleasure and satisfaction, confirming that Kane's transformation had been successful and that he was being welcomed into the community as a full member. "How do you feel?" Rodriguez asked. Though Kane could sense that the question was largely ceremonial, enhanced humans could read each other's physical and emotional states through sensory channels that made verbal communication almost redundant. "Different," Kane replied, his restructured vocal anatomy producing harmonics that carried additional layers of meaning. "Complete, like I've been sleeping my entire life and just woke up." Kane could sense the other enhanced humans throughout the facility, their individual personalities distinct, but connected through the shared consciousness that made the community possible. He was no longer isolated inside his own mind. He was part of a collective intelligence that retained individual identity while sharing knowledge, experience, and emotional states. Through the shared consciousness, Kane accessed memories and experiences from dozens of enhanced humans, learning community protocols and behavioral expectations without needing formal instruction. He understood his role in the recruitment and transformation programs, his responsibilities for facility maintenance and expansion, and his place in the complex social hierarchy that governed enhanced human society. "The others," Kane said, indicating his former team members who were still in various stages of transformation. "How long until they're ready?" "Chen will complete physical transformation within days," Rodriguez replied. "Morales and Blake require additional time. Their psychological integration is proceeding more slowly, but they'll adapt. They all do, eventually." Kane could sense the truth in Rodriguez's statement through pheromone markers that indicated confidence and experience. The transformation process had been refined over decades to minimize psychological trauma while maximizing retention of useful personality traits and memories. Enhanced humans weren't random monsters, they constructed improvements on baseline humanity, designed to preserve the best aspects of human nature while eliminating the weaknesses that made survival difficult in a changing world. "What happens now?" Kane asked, though he could already sense the answer through the shared consciousness. "Now we expand," Rodriguez said, leading Kane through corridors that had been modified to accommodate enhanced human proportions and movement patterns. "The baseline human government continues to send us candidates, though they don't realize their classified installations are actually recruitment centers for enhanced human communities." Kane accessed shared memories that revealed the scope of the program. Dozens of facilities. Across North America, thousands of enhanced humans working to establish territories and recruit new community members. The transformation wasn't random or chaotic. It was a systematic effort to create enhanced human populations in strategic locations that would allow them to survive and thrive when baseline human civilization inevitably collapsed. "The ecological crisis is accelerating," Rodriguez continued, sharing data through subsonic communications that bypass the need for verbal explanation. "Climate change, resource depletion, and social fragmentation will render baseline human civilization extinct within decades. Enhanced humans represent the only viable path for preserving human intelligence and culture through the transition." Kane could sense the truth of this assessment through the shared consciousness, accessing climate models and resource projections that painted a grim picture of baseline humanity's long-term survival prospects. Enhanced humans weren't parasites or invaders. They were humanity's insurance policy, designed to preserve the species when environmental changes made baseline human survival impossible. Through the facility's modified corridors, Kane could see evidence of the enhanced human community's sophistication, architectural improvements, that maximized space efficiency while accommodating enhanced human physical requirements, communication systems that utilized subsonic frequencies invisible to baseline human detection equipment, and resource management protocols that could sustain large populations with minimal environmental impact. The local baseline human government will send more personnel to investigate our facility, Rodriguez explained, sharing tactical assessments through the shared consciousness. They'll be concerned about communication failures and missing personnel reports. Each investigation team represents additional recruitment opportunities. Kane understood the strategy immediately through enhanced pattern recognition capabilities that allowed him to process tactical information at superhuman speeds. Fob Fenrir wasn't just a transformation center. It was bait, designed to attract military and law enforcement personnel who possessed the physical and psychological characteristics necessary for successful enhancement. The baseline human government would never understand what had happened to their personnel, would never realize that their classified installations were actually recruitment centers for a species that represented humanity's evolutionary future. They would continue sending teams to investigate, providing enhanced human communities with a steady supply of candidates for transformation. And if they bring overwhelming force? Kane asked, though his enhanced tactical awareness suggested several response strategies. We relocate, Rodriguez replied simply. Enhanced human communities are nomadic by necessity, capable of abandoning fixed installations and establishing new territories as circumstances require. We've been preparing backup sites for decades. Kane could sense the logic in this approach through the shared consciousness. Enhanced. Humans weren't dependent on complex infrastructure or large-scale industrial systems. They could thrive in wilderness environments that would kill baseline humans, could construct necessary facilities using natural materials and enhanced physical capabilities. As they reached the facility's command center, Kane could see enhanced humans coordinating activities across multiple sites, using communication systems that bypassed baseline human detection while maintaining operational security across thousands of miles. The enhanced human community wasn't a local phenomenon. It was a continental network preparing for the systematic replacement of baseline human civilization. Your first assignment, Rodriguez said, sharing mission parameters through subsonic frequencies, will be establishing contact with enhanced human communities in the Pacific Northwest. We're coordinating territorial expansions to accommodate population growth and resource requirements. Kane accepted the assignment through the shared consciousness, feeling anticipation and satisfaction at the prospect of contributing to enhanced human society's development. His transformation wasn't the end of his military career. It was the beginning of a new phase of service to a community that represented humanity's best hope for long-term survival. Above them, the Montana sky showed the first traces of dawn, but Kane's enhanced senses could detect activities that would be invisible to baseline human observation. Enhanced humans moved through the forest beyond the facility's perimeter, coordinating patrol routes and resource-gathering operations that maintained community security while avoiding detection by baseline human monitoring systems. Kane realized that he had never left Fob Fenrir. He had simply graduated into understanding what the facility had always been. Not a military installation protecting classified research, but a transformation center preparing humanity for evolutionary advancement that would be necessary for species survival. The baseline humans who had sent him here would never understand what they had accomplished, would never realize that their recruitment programs were actually feeding candidates to communities that represented humanity's future. They would continue their classified operations, continue sending personnel to facilities that existed to transform them into something capable of surviving the collapse of the civilization that had created them. Kane looked out through enhanced vision that could penetrate morning mist and detect heat signatures at impossible distances, seeing enhanced humans moving through their territory with confidence and purpose. They weren't monsters or parasites. They were humanity evolved, adapted for survival in a world that would soon have no place for the weak or the unenhanced. The ancient hunger had been satisfied, the recruitment cycle complete. FOB Fenrir would continue operating, attracting new candidates for transformation while serving as a model for enhanced human communities across North America. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., baseline human administrators would review personnel reports and approve new assignments, never understanding that their classified programs were actually feeding the growth of communities that would inherit the Earth when baseline human civilization finally collapsed. Kane smiled with enhanced facial expressions that carried harmonics invisible to baseline human perception, feeling satisfied with his role in humanity's evolutionary future. The transformation was complete, the community expanded, and the ancient territory had claimed new members who would help prepare for the world that was coming. The baseline humans called it FOB Fenrir, but Kane now understood its true nature. It was a graduation center, preparing humanity for advancement into forms capable of surviving the collapse of industrial civilization. And the graduation ceremonies would continue, one transformation at a time, until enhanced human communities were strong enough to inherit the Earth that baseline humanity would soon abandon. Thank you for experiencing this terrifying journey into the heart of lycanthropic horror. If this story sent chills down your spine and kept you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to support more spine-tingling content like this. Leave a comment below telling us which city or country you're watching from. We love connecting with our global community of horror enthusiasts. Also, share in the comments if you've ever heard local legends about werewolves or strange creatures in your region. Every culture has its own tales of shapeshifters and things that hunt in the darkness. Share this story with friends who love psychological horror and creature features. They'll thank you for introducing them to a tale that will haunt their dreams. Your support helps us create more immersive horror experiences that blur the line between fiction and nightmare. What did you think of the military setting and the gradual revelation of the creature's true nature? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one and use your feedback to craft even more terrifying tales. Until next time, keep your lights on, avoid remote military installations, and remember, some territories were never meant to be claimed by humans. The ancient hunger is always waiting, always watching, always ready to reclaim what was never ours to begin with. Sweet dreams.